I'm really thrilled to be here, and a lot of times people say, well, what is this woman from Minnesota doing in New York or California or Florida, Texas, to talk about working with adult ELLs? Well, did you know that Minnesota has the largest number of refugees per capita in the United States? Did you know that? Great. Not all of you. How many languages do you think are spoken in the homes of Minnesota families? Just shout out, when I do a call, just shout answers out. 46? Just under 100, okay? So lots of languages. So we have a long history of working with very diverse groups of learners, way back to the 70s, 80s, all the way through today. And we work with learners that have very unique backgrounds, and many with very limited formal schooling and very limited first language literacy. So we have a lot of background in this, and we've come to realize that it's essential that we really work on beefing things up, is the way I like to think of it, is really increasing the rigor of the instruction we provide. And people they think rigor, what do you mean by that exactly? Well, hopefully by the end you'll have an idea of what I'm thinking of that's maybe a slightly less intimidating sense of rigor when you're working with adult English language learners. Also, we think of transitions oftentimes as being that level right before work or school, but I want you to rethink that idea of transitions, because adult English language learners are transitioning to new opportunities in their lives all the time, whether it be a better job at their current job, where maybe it's being more involved at their kids' schools. So we want to rethink transitions, and then think about how to embed that at all levels of instruction. So we're going to think a little bit about your skill set. You're successful adults, right? Okay? So you got there somehow. So we'll think about that, and then the rationale for moving beyond the basics in adult ESL. And then finally, we're going to look at some lesson enhancements today to see what does this actually look like. So let's just see who's here today. If you work primarily with adult English language learners who are immigrants or refugees, newcomers, raise your hand. And you might keep your hands up a lot today. Who works mostly with international students, maybe in an IEP, okay, or intensive English? I think there might also be MA-TESOL students who maybe aren't teaching yet. I met a few of you in the hall. Who works with folks with limited or limited formal schooling, prior schooling, or limited literacy in their first language, right? How about mostly working with beginners, intermediate, sort of transitions, okay? How about administrators, volunteer coordinators, professional development providers? I hope I didn't miss anybody. If you did, just shout out. Okay, so let's think about your skill set first. So raise your hand if you do these things in your daily life, okay? So do you adapt your language depending on the context? So for example, do you text? Is the language of your text the same as the email you write to your boss when you want to let them know you're going to be sick? Challenge others' opinions, okay? How about listen to others' ideas, contribute your own, okay? How about interpret charts and tables? See, we do these all the time, right? Read differently depending on the purpose. Sometimes you scan, sometimes you skim for the main idea. How about synthesize information from multiple sources? Like when you're going to go buy that new car, you sort of look at a lot of different things to do the next one. Like use that information, maybe draw some conclusions, make decisions. Right, great. And then also, what about note-taking in different parts of your life? And do you do the same kind of note-taking for a phone message as you might do at in a lecture? They're different, right? Okay, so how did you learn those skills? Just think about that for a minute. And by those skills, I'm thinking what we're going to call today academic language, language strategies and to access complex text. And then the third one is critical thinking. So just an example, the academic language might be the, elaborating on your ideas or challenging people's opinions or using different types of language depending on context. Strategies would be that skimming, scanning, reading differently depending on the purpose. And then maybe synthesizing information and then using that to draw conclusions and make decisions would be critical thinking. So just for literally 1 minute, talk to a person next to you. How did you learn those skills? Just 1 minute, turn and talk. I'm going to stop you in a minute. Okay. Okay, that was 1 minute. So, just here, shout out a few ideas. How did you learn those skills? Just school. Sorry? Trial and error, thank you. Yes, trial and error, around the table. Good teachers.
Figuring out what people are doing at the copy machine.
Figuring out what people are doing at the copy machine. Okay, great. Yeah.
Learning from my students every day.
Okay, great. We're learning from your students, right? Great. So we've got lots of opportunities. And we probably come from a school system, by and large, not always, but where in the United States there's often classes on these strategies, right? Who took a study skills class? That's really what it is. We often engage in it. It's sort of the culture of our classroom to engage with these types of skills, right? But what about, you also need these skills a lot. And why are they needed? Well, we need to be ready for work. We need to read charts and graphs and manuals at work. We need to work on these strategies at school, obviously, right? We do a lot of note-taking, reading for different purposes, but also home and in the community. And at home, it might be helping our kids with homework, and in the community, it might be things like being really engaged in the neighborhood watch group, or going to the conferences at school and being able to navigate do you have a parent portal? We had that in high schools. So I could follow how my child was doing. That's how I could keep up. So I need to know both the literacy and the technology, and then that sort of academic language, reading those charts and tables. So I get a lot of practice with it. So back to how we learn it, we're always using it day to day. Now this can pose challenges for English language learners. And it's not because they're not capable adults. It's not because they did some of those things in their own lives. They use critical thinking skills every day. They made their way here to the United States. They found jobs. They figured out how to get their kids in school. However, in an academic setting in many other countries, from my experience, these skills are not really practiced explicitly or necessarily rewarded. You're not rewarded for challenging an assumption, for challenging the teacher, challenging what's in a text. But here, you are, and you're expected to do that, and it's okay to go, question your supervisor. So again, it's not that they don't have the skills. I hate when people say, oh, my ELL learners, they don't think critically. Of course they think critically, but they don't have the language. They don't have the English necessarily to do that. They may lack prior formal schooling. School might look very different. Academic language, and I think of that not just the language of school, but the professional language you need. If you want to look professional, sound professional at work, you want to know the English to question somebody, to ask for clarification. If you don't have the words in English, you can't partake fully. You can't have access sometimes to opportunities. So there's unique challenges there. The other thing, this research I know is a little old, and it's K-12, but I think it's really relevant for the non-formally educated adult English language learners we serve, which was that it can take upwards of 7 to 15 years of intensive practice with academic skills to acquire them if you don't already have those in your first language. So lots of reasons why we really have to build on this. And then just briefly, before we look at some sample activities and think about the classroom, there's the landscape of adult English language teaching today. And one thing I'll share in a bit here is a study my colleague and I did looking at gaps between what we teach in adult ESL and what we know people need when they get to college. Also, the whole idea of, there was a big PIAC, an international survey of adult skills, and they found that low skills really does equate to low-paying jobs. And so we really owe it to learners to provide them with what they need to have gainful employment and more access to that. The college career readiness, are you hearing that all the time, right? Now, that's not the topic today necessarily, but I think of what we're talking about today as a precursor or a scaffold for getting adult English language learners and programs ready for those college career readiness standards. And then this idea of the 21st century skills of really having literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking, problem-solving skills that you can use in a very technology-rich environment. All jobs these days require technology, don't they? Really, when you think about it. And even applying for those jobs, oftentimes you have to do it online. So those 21st century skills take time to acquire. Just briefly, the study that my colleague Kim and I did looked at what are we doing. We surveyed teachers in adult ESL transitions level. What are we doing in the classroom? And then the community college folks that we surveyed were not four-year college. They were all technical career two-year colleges, pre-nursing, construction, and developmental ed. So those results are from that setting. And we found some big gaps between what we teach in some of these areas. So I just want to zoom in on those that relate to our topic today. For example, we found that over 80% of adult ESL teachers were rarely or never teaching synthesizing information from multiple sources. Okay? But 52% of faculty in that college setting, two-year community college, said that's essential. We think that's extremely important. Okay? How about listening and higher order thinking? Same thing, that very few adult ESL teachers were really working on this idea of synthesizing the information from a lecture with other things we've read and bringing that information together to probably make decisions, do projects. But 44% of the college teachers said that's extremely important. We have to be doing that. Same with writing. Only 4% of ESL teachers were doing research papers, and then 33% of the college faculty report that. People say, well, only 33%, but remember, this is a two-year technical college. So even in that setting, 33% of the faculty are assigning big research papers. Okay? And a lot goes into that, obviously, with citations and all of that. And then finally, note-taking. And ESL teachers would say, well, of course I don't do note-taking with lectures. I mean, we don't lecture in ESL. Well, I know, I don't either. But we can do a lot to provide really rich little listening clips and practice note-taking in really creative ways, because it's really important for success. And college, the College Career and Readiness Standards and the 21st Century Skills, I like to remind people that these are just all interwoven and that we need them for work and for academic readiness. And I want to emphasize, again, work. I don't necessarily mean, going and doing a long training, but yes, indeed that. But it might be that you're in a career pathways program. And within that program, you want people to move up incrementally. You need these skills. They're really, really crucial. Now, is this only for adult ESL? No. Look at doing school in the United States. And then this was a class I worked in Vietnam. What do you see? Just shout out a couple differences. So US, Vietnam. Sorry, louder so I can. Size, yes. Teacher-centered, right? Right. Do you see much interaction going on in Vietnam? Do you think there are opportunities to really question the teacher? Look at this set of pictures. Students stand up one at a time. They provide an answer, right? So really very, very few opportunities to engage with content the ways we think of doing in the United States. So what rigor means, adding rigor means having high expectations and developing those language skills, working with real information so we can really promote quality interactions. So what does this look like? Well, let's now do some samples. We're going to explore our options to meet those challenges by looking at some really typical ESL activities. So it's not that I'm really presenting anything new. I've done one-question interview. I've done graphic organizers. But we want to look at them through a different lens. Think about what academic language, what strategies, what critical thinking does that promote? And you do have a handout in your folder that you'll want to pull out if you haven't already. It's just one page back to back. And you'll see a grid, a sort of a snapshot of the kinds of skills we're talking about. Okay? And then underneath that, a short story. Okay. So here's our first lesson enhancement. This is a typical ESL type of reading text, right? And I'm using a very beginning level text, even though you might teach higher levels, and I want you to think, how could these strategies apply to any reading activity? Whether it's a 3-page article or a 2-paragraph story that's in an adult ESL beginning level curriculum. So you can see the stories on the bottom of your first page. So Shua Vang has a new job. She works at Family Mart, part-time, 7 in the morning to noon. Now she can be with her 2 younger sisters and brother in the afternoon, and they go to school and then go to school to work on her English in the evening. Shua usually helps her sister with homework in the afternoon. Sometimes they go to the playground near their house. They often help their mother. They wash clothes and help clean the house. She enjoys her new schedule. So these are the typical questions. Now, I think you'll agree, when I look at beginning level text, these are the type of questions we see, right? Where does she work? What are her hours? How many brothers and sisters does she have? How does she help her mother? So really display questions. There's no analysis. Everything's right there. Now, you might think, well, how on earth could we add elements of those components in your chart to this lesson? Well, I'm going to show you. Who has a yellow card? If you have a yellow card, I want you to, oh, they're right here. Okay, so, okay, if you get a yellow card, you need to come up here. So please come up right away. Okay? All right, so come on out, and please come on out. Hold up your card and face the audience. Okay? Make sure your card's in the right direction. All right, so now, come together. So what is the morning activity? Everybody look in your reading. What's the morning activity? She works at Family Mart. So would the person who has that card please go down there? You're the morning. Thank you. All right, now the evening is going to be down here. Who should go to the evening spot? Goes to school. So who has that card? Okay, good. Now, can you please, there we go. And now we're going to push the afternoon folks together. Now, you're evening, right? You're morning. Go away. Okay. All right, you come on over more. So now, what does she do first in the morning? Let's start thinking about some better questions, okay? Sorry. Okay, let's think of some better questions. When does Shua take her brother and sister to the playground? I know, but when? Do you think before or after they do homework? Who thinks after they do the homework? Who votes for getting out that energy first and then doing homework? Really? Am I alone? Oh, okay. All right. How often do they do laundry every day or do the cleaning every day? What do you think? Usually, okay, but no, not every day, okay. Sometimes, okay, good. How's her life different? How is her life different from, it says in the story, there's a key word that might help you. Well, she enjoys it. What word? She enjoys it. And how do we know there's a change? Now, new job, right? So we've got some signal words in there that tell us that her life is different. Okay. Good, good. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. You may sit down. Okay, so that's one enhancement. So first, sorry. Okay, so grouping, putting things in order, and then asking the right questions. How are these questions different from the original questions? Who remembers the original? What's different about these questions? Just shout out. They take more thought, right? They have to organize information. Good. They use their own thinking, right? Exactly. Whoops, excuse me. Right? So where does she work is just a display question. We're really getting people to think a lot more deeply. All right. Do forgive me, I hit my slides too quickly before. In addition, we can have the students read and fill in this graphic organizer. So rather than answering the questions, what if you tried this? What happens when we say, okay, read and put in the first box what she did in the morning? What will we write there? Work, okay? So students now are working on note-taking skills, even with beginners, okay? So modification 1, filling in the graphic organizer as we read. Modification 2, and modification 3, okay? So now, what happens when we add the line up? What happens when we add the quality questions? Analyze relationships between ideas, you think? Okay, how about categorizing, sequencing? How about finding evidence to support a claim? That comes right out of the CCRS. How are you finding evidence to support a claim? Do you remember what I said? You had to look at the text, and remember I directed you to a signal word. What was the signal word? Now, or, right? So even with beginning level English language learners, we can start to work on all of these skills and strategies, right? Okay? So, I love to think of like, look at all this rigor that we added, okay? All right. You will have access to the PowerPoint later, so don't worry, you don't have to frantically write all of this down. All right. So, okay. Now, if you look in your folder, you should have a slip of paper, and it will have a question for you. Can you find a little slip of paper? Thank you. Hold it up. It looks little slip of paper. Great. All right. So, let's collect some data about each other. So, with your slip, ask 2 or 3 people around you about your question. For example, how often do you use a computer? How often do you use a computer? Every day, every week? Okay. So you'll mark a tally. Put a tally mark. I'm going to give you just 1 minute. See how many people you can talk to around you. Okay? Sorry. Talk to a few people? You talk to a few people? Good, good. All right. Okay. All right. Let's come together. All right. So did anybody need to add another adverb or adverbial phrase? Anybody? Another category, like, so for example, anybody have to add once a year for writing letters? No? Or no? You had to add the past? Okay.
How often do you help your children?
Right.
I did.
I know, yeah. So maybe in some cases someone said, well, I don't have kids now. I mean, I don't have kids at home now, but I used to, or I did before. Sure, good. So now imagine you're in a class and you've collected all this data about your classmates. What could you do with that data? You could make graphs. Good. What else? You could write a narrative. Great. Good. There's a lot you could do, right? And I use the word collecting data because that's really like doing school. Even if you're working with beginners, you could do this with non-literate adult ELL students with pictures only, right? You don't have to be able to read and write to do this activity. So you have all this great data. And now we're going to give students some useful language to talk about it, okay? So most people, some people, 2/3 of the class, half the class, more people use the computer every day than read the newspaper. Or more people read the newspaper than blogs or whatever questions you have. So the theme for this particular one-question interview is on our reading and writing habits. But what would be some other topics that you could use this for? Can you think of some others? Clothing, sure, very basic. You could do this with the color of clothing people are wearing that day.
How many days a week you work?
Right, sure. Days of week that you work, how many? Foods that you like to make? Right. So what I'm hearing here is you're drawing on examples from a basic skills, kind of a typical adult ESL curriculum, and that's fine. I'm not saying to change all of that. That's not really feasible. But what I'd like to say is please add this layer of rigor, add this layer of analysis, of working with real information. This is a way of sort of a precursor to what you need to do if you're going to do a study when you go on to college, if you go to college. Or if your kids are working on their homework and you're trying to understand what this means, you're going to have the language yourself to help them talk about that as an adult learner. If you have a higher level class, you could have higher level sentence frames. I'm a big fan of these. I'm not sure that everybody is, but I'm a big fan of these and having them even on big cards that you can have around the room and direct students to as you're working on this kind of activity. Okay? So, how about creating a graph, you said? So different groups. Obviously, I only had 8 or 9 questions there, so there were several people with question 1, several with question 2. Make some teams of students from each question set and data set, have them create a graph, and then do some kind of a jigsaw where they present to others in class in small groups. And then finally, speaking to your narrative, well, maybe they don't quite have the language yet, so you can give them a paragraph frame that you little by little kind of wean folks off of that gives them the structure for talking about what our class does, what our trends are. And again, this is a very basic sentence frame, but you could provide one that's more advanced depending on the level of your learners. So all of a sudden, rather than just having something in your curriculum, whether it's on clothing and colors or jobs, using the one question interview, using the sentence frames and using the paragraph frames suddenly adds this whole layer of academic language, reading strategies, critical thinking, and some other related academic skills. So for example, you're using an academic register when you teach students how to say 2/3 of the class does this, half the class, very few people, okay? They're learning how to summarize and synthesize information. This again, even with beginning level learners, they're seeing the organization of a text. So in other words, you have all the data and you're seeing how do I make that into a short essay? How do I put that, what's the structure of that text? Interpreting graphs, transferring information. So that's a big one. I had that for the snapshot for the first activity, the Shua's life story. That's a big part of work in school, isn't it? That you have to be able to see that there's a graph, but it means something else, either verbally or in writing. And you have to see the connections between a paragraph and how things are displayed visually. The learners are engaging in creating that themselves, so they're going to understand those connections much more deeply between the significance of a bunch of tally marks, a graph, and then a paragraph. And they all actually convey the same information, right? But in different ways. That's what it means to do school or to do work successfully. So we're providing them with that support. Also categorizing, analyzing, collecting, organizing data, numeracy skills, which are essential. Even things like, what are those tally marks about, right? That might be new for students. Interviewing, reporting, and then conducting research in a sense. Okay, all right? So you ready for another sample? Okay. Now, if you look on the back side of your sheet, you're going to see 2 grids, A and B, an A and a B grid. So something else I love to do with curricula is add short 1-minute interview clips. I do this a lot, and this is something very low tech. I use my little Canon SureShot camera, literally, made it into an MP3. And you can do this on any topic in your curriculum, just anything. So this is a sample from a unit we did on different areas of culture, topics about culture, and I always want to go beyond that sort of surface level on the iceberg. You have the holidays and culture as holidays and clothing, or deep culture, which is really looking at norms, values, and people, how do I dig more deeply on this topic with English language learners? So for that topic, I interviewed 3 different people on what surprised them when they moved to a new culture. What was something that was really striking for them? So I would like to share with you one of those clips, and you can decide if you want to be an A or a B, but what the students would do is half the class would fill in the A grid, and half the class would fill in the B grid. So what do you notice? Do they have the same answers? No. So everybody's listening for different things. All right? So let's meet Sina and see what surprised him about, he's an immigrant himself, and he's the third row. He talks about coming to the United States 20 years ago and some things that still surprise him.
I've lived in the United States for over 20 years now, but one of the first things that struck me when I came here has to do with food and eating habits. The first thing that struck me was how people eat in the street and in public. You would see someone drinking pop in the bus. The other thing that I found odd was how in an office environment people would sit at their desk and eat alone. I always considered food or lunch a collective activity where we would sit together and relax and enjoy conversation and so on. I found eating on your own rather sad and unhealthy somehow. The third thing that I found interesting is that people would be eating something without necessarily offering it to you. Again, where I come from, in Iran, people always at least go through the gesture of offering you a piece of the cake or a sip of the drink that they're having. But here, no, it's considered something personal, and they eat and drink in front of you. And even now, I would say after well over 20 years, I am still struck by that and haven't gotten used to it yet.
Okay, all right. I heard applause for Sina. Okay, so now imagine, how does this compare to what you might see in a unit on holidays? What are some things that come to mind? Much more interesting, isn't it? More engaging. It really makes you think, and it's the voice of somebody who's been in the same shoes as your learners. So while my other two interview clips are people who are from the States and went abroad, when I watch learners watching this video, their faces just light up because they can really, really connect. Also think about then the jigsaw, the jigsaw grids. Now you have to do note-taking, listen selectively. So all of a sudden, by adding this short 1-minute video clip with those activities, you're having students identify main ideas or themes when they do them, because there are 3, and the first time, just listen, where are they from, what surprised them, and then the second time, they listen and fill in their grids. They also have to make some inferences, because in some of the clips, people don't say outright how they feel. Okay, so they have to listen for evidence about, are they happy, unhappy about this practice? Comparing, contrasting, categorizing, analyzing, questioning their beliefs about cultural practices. A lot of academic skills with note-taking. And then the idea that, back to remember my data about lectures and note-taking, this is the kind of thing you can do in your ESL class. It's like a mini lecture. It's real. It's authentic information, and it's high interest, and they're very easy to create. All right, so I think we have time for one more. We do have time. Okay, so now I use a lot of graphic organizers. So graphic organizers, things like a T-chart, Venn diagrams, right, those sorts of things. They're wonderful because they don't take much prep. You can even draw them on the board and have your students write them in their books. You don't have to have a handout. And they suddenly add a layer of rigor because they help people see the organization of a text. They help learners organize information. So we're going to see what happens when it's a lesson on a reading. This is for an advanced level class, a lesson on birth order theory. So it's a text with sections by birth order, obviously. So what's the typical firstborn, middle child, youngest, or only child? So it's a theory. So they're also going to learn about a theory, sort of theory creation, and maybe they're going to challenge the theory. Maybe they think it's just baloney. Okay, I don't know if you say that in New York. That's Minnesota, baloney. Okay, all right. So let's see what happens when learners, this is ESL, an ESL class, learners are talking about their own birth order. They've grouped according to their own birth order, and they're filling in that T-chart with what are the benefits and the drawbacks of their own birth order. Just all I'll say, I think it speaks for itself. What do you notice about learner, their engagement, the kind of language they're using?
Oh no, right? Because for me, I gotta take care of my parent when I got older, and then
I mean when you are just a child.
I gotta go to school.
Parents struggle more.
The older
They
usually
struggle more. The second one, you choose what your second.
we already
and your
practice
older
enough
sister,
in
you
our
practice.
first. Right.
You learn from
Giving only one handout per group assures that learners collaborate to complete the task.
We can put it that way.
sisters.
I got it right. We are all brothers or sisters, but
Right.
and
You feel left out because the
feel
older
left
get
out.
more attention.
You
How
only
about
get
that?
more attention, and
The
those are
older
the
and the
youngest.
baby usually do.
so what will be?
Think of the clothes, you always get the leftovers.
That's what I
or
said.
the,
Oh yeah.
So what's your group now?
Okay. All right. So what I noticed is lots of engagement, right? And they're really relating the topic to their personal experiences, right? How can you tell that they're really listening to one another? Body language, right? The way they're leaning into each other. So it's a much richer way to connect to the topic ahead of time. Now, the other things that we do with this particular reading, instead of reading and answering comprehension questions, just like with our Shua sample earlier, right? Typically, that's what we might see. They read and they fill in this T-chart. So the firstborns only fill in this segment, the middle children this segment, the lastborns that segment, and the only child that segment. And then once they've read, compared it to their own experiences, their own benefits, drawbacks, then they have to mingle and exchange information and fill in the entire tree diagram. So all of a sudden, and this was not from, I mean, I don't see this in textbooks, okay? But this is easy enough to add, right? It's that layer. So suddenly, by adding, look at all the academic language, recognizing the organization of a text, especially look at all the great reading strategies that we start to develop when we add these layers like graphic organizers. A lot of critical thinking, and what we do for this particular lesson is that we invite the learners to to make up a list of questions and then go interview others outside of class and then challenge the theory, because most of them say, well, that's not me. I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm like both a firstborn and a lastborn. I just, I have a lot of the traits of the two. And then a great practice with communication strategies, note-taking, planning, using the T-chart, organizing their own ideas logically. And these are all skills and strategies they could then apply when they're studying on their own, learning on their own. Okay? So just to wrap up, let's just think about it. We have all these forces behind it, 21st century skills, college and career readiness standards, kind of those differing ways of doing school. But I hope that you saw that what we did were pretty standard communicative ESL activities, right? But it's all about how you present it, how you frame it. So, there's less, it's giving students who have less familiarity with communication strategies great practice. It's giving them that academic and professional language practice, that sort of language of access to more opportunity. It's helping them access more complex texts and giving them higher levels of critical thinking. And finally, any of these activities really promote a lot of teamwork, which is a big part of school and work here in the United States. And again, just to remind you, they're typical activities. The ones I really want to highlight that maybe teachers haven't thought of so much is that whole idea of data collection and the idea of high interest 1 to 2 minute video clips that you can bring in. Use lots of jigsaw, lots of grid activities that you're already doing, I'm sure, but sort of look at it through this different lens. So when I think of it is that adults are always transitioning to new opportunities. A transitions class shouldn't just be the name for those classes right before you go to work. It should be what we're doing from the get-go. So I hope you'll have rigor from the get-go going forward. And I really want to thank all of you for coming today. If you want to contact me, you'll see my email is on your handout as well. And I also wanted to note that one of the video clips there comes from a series. It's in your references. It's developed by a nonprofit, New American Horizons. And a lot of these practices, you can see them in action in some of those videos. So thank you so much, and I hope to talk to some of you later in the afternoon. We'll do a sort of a Q&A at the end of the day. So thank you.